Okay. Okay, so I hope everything is fine and we're live. This is a bit of a test, so if anyone is there, let me know if there are any problems or if you can't hear or yeah, if there are any issues. Anyway, we're here with Niccolò tonight. Niccolò Menozzi, he's the founder and coordinator at the moment of the Spadone Project, which is a how many years has it been going on, Niccolò?
Quite a lot. It started in 2017, so it's 8 years.
Okay, so yeah, so a 7 year long research project into the Spadone, which if you're watching this video, you probably know what it is. But it's a sword that is incredibly iconic. I think everyone has seen it or recognizes it. But it's also a sword that I feel has maybe not the amount of spotlight which it may deserve, if not anything else, just because of how unique it is on the landscape of swords and even in the kind of time it came to be used. So anyway, tonight we're going to talk about the Spadone. We're going to talk about the research project. So it's going to be a bit of full intro, I think, into Spadoni for both people that know about it and people who want to know more about it. If you have any questions, we're going to have a question time by the end of our talk. So feel free to add them into the chat or save them for later. And with that being said, I think we can kick it off. I see there are already a few people online, which is really cool. So
Nice.
yeah, just one thing. Sorry for the late reply. This is a little bit of a test. It's my first stream, so we kind of agreed yesterday to go live
Yes.
rather than a recorded interview. So next time we'll improve the process. So okay, let's kick it off. Niccolò, do you want to introduce yourself and let's hear a little bit about the project as well?
Yeah, of course. But well, the first thing to say is that this is not my main job. This is just a hobby. So the project is something side I feel my free time with, but usually I work as a UX and UI designer. So what I've studied in my youth when I was at university is basically design, graphic design. By a living, I design software actually. And some branding. So this is my kind of background. It's not strictly related to history research. Is something new to me, at least. Is something that I came to be interested into when I decided to start researching for this project, and was due to mainly starting fencing, so historical fencing back in 2016. And everything started with longsword fencing. My club in Italy was focusing on Fiore de Liberi, that maybe some of the people here listening to us know about. Is the the oldest treatise of fencing of the Italian tradition, dated to the 14th century. And from there, I just wanted to shift to something that was more of my interest, that is the Renaissance period, because I've always been really interested in the kind of aesthetic and kind of warfare of the 16th century, not really interested in the medieval period. And so I took the initiative and I started studying something different from my club. And of course, from the start, nothing that was really new to other clubs in Italy or elsewhere, but just finding what other people were studying in terms of Renaissance Italian fencing. So, for example, Achille Marozzo, Opera Nova, was one of the interesting sources to study. And at some point, I remember that I found out about Iberian Montante, and I started studying some of the few sources we have, like the manuscript from Diogo Gomes de Figueiredo, is a Portuguese fencing master from the middle of the 17th century. And I basically spent a summer doing solo drills and studying these techniques of big swords. And from that period, I started thinking, okay, we have all these fencing treatises, and we know a lot from them on how to use two-handed swords, both from the perspective of medieval longsword, so the kind of two-hander that is shorter and lighter, to the bigger part of the spectrum that basically is the great sword of the end of the 16th century, and for what concerns some of the Iberian tradition, even sources in the 17th century. I said I started from them, and I started asking myself, we know that, but what we know about the historical context? So all of the stories and the stuff that usually we read about, some books maybe, or we listen to a video on YouTube, a podcast, something, you always know there are some stories like the pike chopping and all that kind of tales, but I wasn't able to find anything outside of Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not the best source, and I realized that there were really few footnotes and sources from the period. And so somehow I started searching, and I started from Google Books. I realized that a lot of material was actually scanned, was digitized, and available for free, but no one cared about reading those books and finding information. And I think that the main reason was, and still is, that, for example, Italian is like a wall for many people researching about old antique weapons, because as we had already the occasion of discussing, there's some kind of English and American centric interest on side of this topic of ancient weapons, and for some researchers it's not that easy to delve into a different language. So someone that know how to read is required to get new information, at least those that had been lost and not written and reported in more modern books published, for example, over the 19th or 20th century. And yes, please.
No, I just think you're touching on some interesting points that then apply to outside of the Spadone as well. I think for a lot of people who are interested in swords, the first obstacle is, we were just talking about it earlier, the accessing some kind of in-depth information that goes beyond what you can find in a video or on a Wikipedia article or on some very generic level. So and this, I think, because it's been a starting point for me as well in my research of swords. So if anyone here watching or in the future is at that point where you don't know where to start and you feel like, you know, the subreddit or the what you find online is starting to be tight, Google Books or digitalized or Internet Archive and stuff have a huge amount of first-hand account documents.
I think I lost you, Gabriele.
Yes, we're back.
Okay, nice, because
Yeah,
everything
of course,
froze.
yes, there has to be some kind of technical issue, I guess, is part of the experience. So, okay, so you mentioned how you got into the project, and I think I have maybe the standard questions, which are, you know, the what, why, how, and when, and so on. So, well, the why, I think we already got a little bit of an idea. Also, I heard you mention sometime that you already came into it from Warhammer, I think, like a certain interest in.
Yeah,
Was it? Yeah,
absolutely.
okay. So
So
there's the full mix of academia, practice, and like fantasy gaming, which is
yeah, absolutely.
a good
Because
mix.
first you're a child, you're a young adult, you are someone interested into something that passionates you. So first step is passion, and at some point, if you have the skill or the will to go a further step, probably you're going to want to know more. So what is fantasy is no um, doesn't satisfy everything, and so
Exactly.
you realize that sometimes history is even more fantasy than fantasy itself, if you get
Yes.
what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I think maybe a brief timeline of the Spadone could be useful to get everyone on board before we kind of dive into your research and the work you're doing. So, where does it start? When does it end, kind of, and what's its main distribution
Mhm.
geographically?
Okay, well, geographically, we can say that probably it was widespread on all the Mediterranean area. So Italy, Iberia, Iberian Peninsula, sorry, Germany as well. We have some accounts from the Balkans and the space around Greece, Albany, you know, all that part because was part of the Venetian Republic, and all everything that revolves around the war against the Turks. So even in Cyprus, in some of the Greek isles, we have accounts of some battles or skirmishes. Um, from the timeline point of view, usually most of the people know that is a Renaissance weapon, so it is dated to the 16th century from the beginning of the century. But actually, we have more sources now that prove that in some shape and style, the longer some of the longer blades were available already in the middle of the 15th century. So I like to say that from some perspective, the 15th century is the new 16th century because there are things from the Renaissance that actually are older. And this is concerning this concerns the longer spectrum. And then there's a different separate discussion about what today we call longsword. That that is the shorter weapon, is the light one, is a side weapon, so can be carried at the belt. Is lighter, usually is more pointy, is a weapon meant to cut, but also to thrust with quite an ease. really pointy blade, and was widespread, commonly used, but in a different context. And this is why I prefer to focus on the big part of the spectrum, because it's the kind of weapon that has not been researched as deep as the longsword, because the longsword is probably the most famous weapon in the historical fencing panorama. So it's the first weapon that almost everybody want to learn how to fight with, while Spadone and Iberian Montante are more niche. Over the last years, more people came to know about them, but still they are not that widespread and common. Mainly because from the fencing point of view, you cannot do all the things that you can do with the longsword, because is more dangerous to practice the actual use. Because one of the difference is longsword is meant for, I do not want to say just dueling, but is a weapon that is really useful one against one. When you go to longer blades, heavier blades, the focus shifts toward scenarios in which you need to focus and fight against multiple opponents. In that case, you're going to need more horizontal and twirling cuts all around. And of course, from the physics point of view, may be more dangerous for concussion, blows to the head. Even if you are geared up, is not really safe if you do not trust what the people around you are able to do and how to do it.
I suppose also there may be cello effect in a sense, like as an instrument. It's even just the size and the cost and the availability of it. Long swords, I see even reproductions you can find really easily and for very decent prices, and they're smaller. But a bigger kind of sword, if you don't have a big closet, can can influence your.
And it's a problem for logistics.
Yeah,
because if you need to take a plane to go somewhere, or if you have a small car, having like 1 meter and 70 centimeters of sword is not easy to carry around, and heavy, cumbersome. I know because I have quite a lot here. every time I move around to get to a workshop, I happen to have to bring my sword, because that's another point. Not everybody has the money or the will to buy a big sword that cannot be used in tournaments, for example, the usual fencing tournaments. And so someone is interested in in attending workshop. But when you go to a workshop, except in maybe Germany is quite liked and widespread. But for example, in Italy, since some years ago, I had to bring mine for other people as well. It was a pleasure, of course, but was cumbersome.
So I think you touched on a few interesting points, which maybe would be nice to expand a bit on. So one thing was the starting pre-Renaissance. So you mentioned that there's already, let's say, the germ of the spadone is already in the Middle Ages, or at least in the late Middle Ages. And I think in the common understanding of the spadone, there's, as you mentioned already, the idea of the cutting through pikes, and there's the idea of its use on the typical Renaissance battlefield. So what are your thoughts about why this kind of sword originated instead in a earlier phase, which doesn't necessarily see the same combat as you would see, let's say, in the Renaissance? So it seems almost to develop before its context of use, let's say.
Yeah, complex topic.
Sorry.
Is a mix of different events and things happening during the 15th century. We have, for example, a problem with cavalry, a double problem with cavalry. At some point, it became too costly. Was really a cost for kingdoms to and even for noblemen to purchase the horses, to arm themselves with a lot of armor, full plate armor. We have sources of this kind telling about how that kind of warfare based on heavily armored knights was starting to be something too cumbersome for the period. And there's this switch to infantry. And we know that from the late 15th century, 14th century, if I remember right, was the period in which the Swiss soldiers began to understand and use the new formations and tactics with the pikes, at least in the first part, of course, not the Renaissance pikes, but longer lances, but medieval time, not exactly what came to be. But the point was these processes were going on. So infantry was gaining importance. Cavalry was sorry, I don't get the English name. Was defeated
Yes.
in more important battle. For example, during the wars between Burgundy and the Confederates in Switzerland. In that moment, you had battlefields where light armored, a big number of light armored infantrymen were forced to fight really heavy armored opponents. In that context, and this is one of my theory, of course, we do not have sources that prove it 100%, but I think that it's part of the truth, is a part of the picture. In that context, having longer blades was I lost you. Let's see if you come back. The joy of the life. It's funny because every time I make a live, there's always some problem.
Here we are back again. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
What's going on, but we're still here.
No problem. I stopped for you, so
Thank you.
You did not lose some of the discussion. However, point was, in that context, you have a lot of lightly armored fighters, and if you have learned some of the historical fencing, you know very well that going against someone in full plate armor without much protection is like suicide. You're not going to win a fight in that kind of context, probably. And so having longer blades along with other kind of weapon, of course, we're not stating that was specifically something related to the greatsword, but having a weapon that was able to gain more reach against, for example, horses, against the legs of the horse, or even to put more distance between you and your full plate armored opponent, could be a way to improve your tactics and survive more. We know that a blade is not really useful against plate,
Yeah, that
So
was
one could say that could not be the reason, because of course you would choose another kind of weapon to go against them. But we need, of course, to understand that that kind of formation, that kind of battlefield, we cannot expect all of the soldiers to have standardized weapons. We know they were using different kind of weapons. So among them, we cannot exclude that some of the people that at that time were purchasing their weapon. So every family, every person from the Confederation getting into battle probably was carrying something from maybe one of his old I don't know, the father, the grandfather,
yeah.
something they purchased themselves. So we cannot exclude that from personal initiative they decided to slowly improving the length of the blade, making the blade heavier, because
Yep.
of course a mace is able to hit harder the helmet of a knight than a blade. But if you want something that is more is not really specialized yet, is something that is more flexible, you have a longer blade, you can fight hard against someone that has no armor. At the same time, if you face someone with an armor, maybe you can strike heavier, and some way you gain time. You gain
Mhm.
time in order to have your friends, your packmen around you, helping you, maybe stopping the knight. And
So, sorry, in a sense, then it could almost, if I hear you correctly, one option, at least for its origin or development, is almost not, is the opposite of a hyper specialized weapon. It's almost a weapon that develops to kind of fill evolving need in changing warfare, let's say. So better reach is useful, but some people may still want a blade rather than a pike or a pole weapon or a mace. So this kind of seems to cover most of the needs in an adequate way.
yes, is just a theory, of course.
Okay.
Is one of the topic that I try to cover on the book that is in development right now. I think is not the whole story. Is something I have thought a lot about. We know that there are some sources stating that in that period, lower class soldiers began to hit the horses, because
Hmm.
according to a different kind of battling from the medieval period, knight again knight. So it is called something more chivalric. Right now I do not remember exactly the term that is used, but that kind of war, nobleman against nobleman. So there's a different way to
Hmm.
handle a fight between people of the same class.
Yeah.
But when lower classes infantrymen started to be more present, even in number, more people involved, there was no um, ransom for
Yeah.
captured noblemen. Uh, Warfare started to become more cruel, more
Hmm.
violent, and sources state that in that period, infantrymen started to hit the horses. Of course, if you are a nobleman, you paid a lot the horse,
Yeah.
and your opponent is a nobleman. He knows very well how much cost a horse. So it's like a mutual
Yes.
understanding. You do not want to harm the your goods, what you own. But
I think
against,
it's
yeah, is
no,
different.
sorry, it's really interesting because, of course, it's changes in warfare, changes in society, though, because we're already, yeah, we're seeing the radical changes in society in the late Middle Ages. So this modernization, the breaking of these century-old traditions, both in approach to nobility, but even how that, and it's interesting to see that these perhaps also find outlet in the way weapons are created and used. I had a question always about, it kind of, I think it relates to what we've been talking about now. Do you think there's also a maybe aesthetic reason for the sword? So as you're mentioning, it's a sword used in a phase of death or decline of the chivalric kind of warfare and nobles against nobles and stuff. Would maybe the use of a big fancy sword, in a sense very visible, be chosen both maybe for intimidation, but also as a kind of showcase of I can afford this rather than just a very long polearm?
Maybe. We know that even though in warfare there's this distinction between medieval longsword and greatsword, we know that even in the medieval time, parade, processional greatsword were used. So the very long sword is not something that 100% was created during the 15th century, but we can mostly agree on the fact that the very long, big, heavy swords of the medieval time are just a few, and by size and weight, we can say that they were just meant for ceremony and something that was not strictly warfare related. And we even have some Italian sources from the medieval time, for example, for the city of Bologna, stating that there were some representative of the city classes involved in the politics of the city that had this kind of insignia. So the sword was a symbol for some of these representative. And so we can say that maybe from that period where some of the warfare weapon took something from the ceremony. So
Okay.
yeah, if you, I did not express it well, but I think that
I think it was quite clear.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
You mentioned sources, so of course, in opening you mentioned how the starting point, let's say for documentation, were digitalized sources. But I know you also work a lot with iconography and images, and of course, your other source would be the actual swords themselves. So, do you want to maybe talk a little about, yeah, what your everyday pool of sources for your research is?
Yeah, of course. I worked a lot with iconography. Probably right now is more than 200 among paintings and woodcuts from the German-speaking area. But of course, paintings from the Iberian Peninsula, from Italy, and also from something from England. I really value the use of iconography because is one of the best way we have to trying to spot the right period for sword styles, because most of the I would say every written source we have is not really helpful in understanding where on the timeline place put the surviving specimen we have. But if you look at paintings and woodcuts, we have a huge help in understanding one, when probably they came to be made. So at some point they started making a specific design for a sword, and for some period, some decades, the style was used. And the second thing is where exactly, because today you see many replicas, and for fencing, for collectors, there are a lot of producers that propose their version of greatswords, but most of the time they are a mix of styles with not really an aesthetic that that sticks to the originals. Sometimes this is a way to make something new that is not bad. Some other times is something that is made because we are not enough knowledgeable about this particular topic. And I can say that I myself, over the years, I changed opinion, I discovered new things, and I had to improve and to change my point of view of some of this stuff. And mhm.
Iconography also helps, I suppose, understand how they were even just carried, right? Because if I'm familiar with some of the woodcuts of Dürer, where I think it's Dürer at least, that made a series of Landsknecht engravings or woodcuts, and it's really interesting to see them in daily, like just the way weapons are carried. I don't remember now specifically if he has spadoni or just catbaggers, but it kind of projects you into the everyday life and the way, because of course the fencing is one thing, people use them a lot, but it's way more something that you carry and don't use more than something that
Mhm. Absolutely. And an interesting thing that I think about a lot is that nowadays we have all these fencing treatises, and they seem to be a lot. So we think about this past and think that probably because the swords were around everywhere, everybody was some kind of, maybe not a killing machine, but someone so knowledgeable about the proper way of fencing. But actually, personally, I think not. Having a sword, having the money to buy a sword, feeling the need to have a sword to defend yourself doesn't implies automatically that you have the money to attend a fencing sal, or even that you live in a place back in the days where a fencing master was available to teach you something, or even that if you are a soldier, automatically in that time you had an actual training on using this kind
yeah.
of blades. And I think this is true for great swords as well as for other kind of blades, because we need to remember that the sword is just a side weapon, especially in warfare, is not what you usually use most of the time. And so we can expect pike training to be something. And I have one of my closer collaborators in this project, Julian Ronneberger. He's German, so he teaches me a lot about German sources. Many times he told me that for the German-speaking area, we have many sources talking about fairs or trainings or tournaments, all revolving around, for example, crossbow shooting, or even guns shooting. There are some woodcuts that are really funny because they looks like nowadays targets when you go shooting with those little wood houses where the guy stands with the gun shooting at the target. So Renaissance really was already a period in which swords were not that central and important and as in the Middle Ages. At least this is what I got by researching so much and talking about other people that provided with me sources from other country, and I think is really interesting. Just
And
one
yes,
last thing that I think is really funny. I found a source from the Republic of Venice, mostly middle of the 16th century. Was a printed book with a collection of laws. Some of these laws referring to weapons carrying and such. And that document already stated that the number of murders having place in Venice and the country was so high, with gunpowder, lethal guns, and pistols, and the like, that was really like a pest, was something that they really wanted to control in some way. And it's really funny because I suspect that most of the people would think about the dark alley of a Renaissance of medieval town with guys with daggers trying to stab
Yeah.
themselves, and they were actually carrying guns everywhere, and
I think
masks.
that's the famous image when you think about the Cinque Dea is,
Yeah.
oh, it's short and broad, used to stab people in the alley. Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. I think, yeah, I think being able to connect the events of history in its lived context, let's say, is really important. Even in looking at the objects, you can't just see them, let's say, just do a measurement and assume that you understand things. And yeah, well, there's a whole bunch of points. I was trying to follow a bit of yeah, point by point, but I think you raised a lot of interesting things that I actually want to dive into right away. So one is you mentioned sources from different areas. And again, going back to sources, there's the issue, I think, of linguistic complexity, I think. So on one hand, certain words are used to talk about many different things. So I know that when we talk about like ceremonial use of spadoni in Italy, they're still alive in many areas, but the spadone is not usually a spadone in the sense we intend it now. Sometimes it's just a big sword, for example. But then there's also the linguistic aspect of the different regional words, so Montante or Zweihander. So how does this influence or affect your research? And are there differences between these kinds of words? Like, do these different words represent different objects in a sense that you can classify, or are they just different ways different languages refer to the same kind of thing?
We came to the conclusion that from the linguistic point of view, they basically are the same thing. So we spend a lot of time doing linguistic research. Actually, in the book, we are finishing working on the third chapter that is like, I think, more than 30 pages just for linguistic topic. And what sources is telling us? Sources tell us that if we cross different description of different books from, for example, Iberian Peninsula and Italy, if we check some old books that were translated back then from one language to the other, we see that basically they just use the names they wanted to use with not strict rule. For example, we have sometimes Spadone is translated with Montante. Some other times we could have, I go by memory, something like in the Italian book is Spadone, but then it's translated like Espada de dos manos, which in Castilian is 200 swords, of course. So we have this kind of cross use of terms that put together depict a context in which basically they knew what they were referring to was some kind of big swords, but it doesn't seem to be some rule that everybody knew about. We even have some sources, for example, some inventories from the arsenal in Venice. Sorry, not the arsenal, but the Doge's Palace armory.
The Council of the Ten.
Yeah, exactly. Fabulous collection, by the way. We have some inventories from the 16th and even from the 17th century. They are like 3 or 4 documents. You can find the transcription in the old catalog of the collection from the 90s, written by Umberto Franzoi. And you spot that some pages talks about Spadoni, and some pages talks about Spadoni da una mano e mezza, hand and a half Spadoni, hand and a half swords. You read the numbers of the inventories and you realize that according to different periods, they actually changed the name of the same weapon. And so they were free of using according to the maybe the person that was writing the stuff, or maybe even because it was just intended as that kind of swords. General is not a 100 sword, is a big sword, can be Montante, can be Spadone, can be Spada due mani,
this is
all of the same.
Yeah, this is something that recurs a lot with ancient or antique terminology. You see that the use is way more elastic than we tend to think about it now. We fit things in boxes that really, and I think this and the linguistic aspect of the linguistic difficulties. I see the Latrix joined now, and this I know is something that he looks into a lot. So I hope this is interesting for you. Like the different translations and variations in terminology. And from a methodological perspective, Niccolò, do you maintain this variety when you refer to Spadoni, or have you chosen more to use the term Spadone and as a blanket term, let's say, or do you keep that ambiguity going?
I think just because I tend to use Spadone because I'm Italian, and so I take the perspective of an Italian person. So for me, is Spadone, and I prefer to use Spadone because for the modern talking, it is the best way to point to a specific kind of size without making confusion with the medieval counterpart that is the shorter one. And usually, at least in Italy, is called Spada due mani. And in the book and in research, I always try to express the nuances. I try to use, if I have a specific context, if I'm talking about, for example, a German source, I want to use the German name. I try to keep the context of the original source. For me, it's very important because as soon as you switch to some modern interpretation of what you have, you're already giving a different perspective. You are mudding the source. I want people to read and understand the actual source. Is more complex, is not easy, is not the easy way of doing things, but is important. But of course, if I'm just having a chat with someone, I just prefer to use the modern way we refer to the weapon, especially because if you are in a fencing context, is really understandable, is really known what you are referring to if you talk about Montante and what if you talk about longsword, for example. And in that regard, I think there's a distinction. For example, all the non-fencing sources tells the story I have already described some minutes ago. But if you take the fencing manuals from the time, you already see that there is not completely different, but there's a different take on the topic. And maybe you can understand that from the point of view of a fencing master, that is someone that is proficient with that kind of weapons and is actually, if not his main work, is something he really knows about. Probably is the kind of person that want to make a clearer distinction between weapons, because the size of the weapons most of the time reduce the kind of things you can do with the weapon, because it's heavier, because it's cumbersome, more or less, changes the context. But these are both true, context, part of the same complex picture.
Yeah, and speaking of that, when we talk about use of the spadone, since you mentioned sources that kind of are not only fencing masters, but they're actually documents, let's say, of the time in terms of lived experience. Assuming, of course, from my perspective, as someone who has not yet read your book, but the assumption is that its main use would be on the battlefield. But do you have also documentation or indications that it had a more kind of civilian use outside of parades, of course?
We have some sources. Some of them are even already available in books written by other researchers that I personally know, and we helped each other. They already published something, but I got in contact with them. They are helping me improving the research, and these are sources from Spain, for example. We even have something about Italian context. So we can say, yes, sometimes the civilian use was a thing, but what is not a detail, and many people in the fencing fencing context do not realize, not because they are ignorant, but just because it's not that easy to get to the information. Most of the time, this civilian use was outside of the law. So it was not something that was socially and culturally accepted as normal. Was something out of the norm. Was something related to murder, something related to going by night, in the middle of the night, going around in the city with maybe some piece of armor on your body and some blades, just going around for making trouble, maybe to murder someone, to make an ambush, some kind of that brutal stuff. So we even have sources telling us that was not really the kind of social accepted weapon, like having a sword on your side because you are a nobleman and so you are allowed to walk on the city streets with them by you. For example, there's a nobleman, Italian nobleman, middle of the 16th century, Pomponio Torelli, was a count, I think, count of Montechiarugolo. He wrote a treatise about knightly thing. It's not really a fencing treatise, it's just a compendium of stuff related to noblemen. And he discusses the weapons that are suited to a nobleman. And for example, Spadone is not one of them, because Pomponio tell us, if you're walking on the street with your spadone, you're giving to other people the idea that you are willing to something not good, and you want to prevail over everyone at any cost. So it's not a knightly weapon. Or for example, the German name Schlachtschwert, so battle swords, is really a hint to the original use of this kind of weapon.
Yeah, so I mean, and it does make sense because, of course, as you mentioned, extra reach, extra even concussive damage, even if you don't cut through someone, if you're going with that, and just the cumbersomeness of the sword, you don't take that out not to use it. So if you're on the street with one, you probably have some nefarious project.
Yes.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think we're reaching the hour, and we haven't yet talked about the spadone as an object itself. So we have talked about the fact that there's a variety of names for a variety of different swords, in a sense, But I also know that part of the modern research does have some rules or criteria based on which you can classify something as a spadone or not. And of course, when we are talking about a spadone, we do have a archetype in mind, let's say. So maybe we can use a few minutes now to talk about the spadone itself as an object, what makes one, and why that those qualities are defining.
Yes. There are differences based on regional styles. A really interesting work on this has been done by Neil Melville. That is one of the authors that I was mentioning before. So if some of the listener want to read something already published, this book by Neil Melville you can find on Amazon. It was really interesting. And I'm actually cooperating with him. He is helping us with the proofreading of the English translation of the book. So we are really team working to make something more complete. By the way, different regional styles. Styles could be intended as a mix of what are the hilt features and what are the blade features, because we know that historically blades were made in some production sites and then sold all around. So we can have Italian blades in Germany, German blades in Scotland or England, maybe even Spanish blades in Germany, and so on. But we know that some of the times these blades were sold without the hilt. So the hilt was something that was crafted in the place where the blade was meant to be used, or maybe even sometimes finished in a place and then sold again, completed in another place. There's really a lot of information about this, and I think that maybe this topic would require a dedicated live to discuss it in depth. But
we can organize.
Yeah. What can I say is that if from the linguistic point of view, we do not have much difference between the word used to name the weapon, from the point of view of style, we indeed found, I and Julian, while researching and study the specimen we have found, we have a collection of more than 200 blades, weapons, sorry, 200 grades what we are analyzing right now. We found that, for example, Iberian style tend to be more slim, thin, lighter, is somehow more elegant than other styles. Italian style is like in between the Spanish style and the German style, having the German style more expressive and exaggerated style and proportion. Usually, the heavier, the more decorated and more flamboyant specimen are from Germany. And all the wavy blades, the jagged blade, the huge heels that probably most of you have seen at least one, they are 100% German stuff. Not a fan of them personally, but an important fact that I want to underline, I try to underline every time I talk about this, is that that specific kind of German style, and maybe I can share some images because I do not
Absolutely.
want to. Let me check.
And I'll take advantage of this break to, if any of you watching has any questions, we're kind of reaching, I think pretty soon we'll move into question time. So feel free to drop them in the comments and we'll address them in. We still have a couple of topics that I'd like to cover before moving them to a future live stream, but we're getting towards the question time.
Okay. I think let's see if I drag and drop, something happens.
Let's see, because this is a test for me as well of the system. I may be able to. Yes, so
Okay.
there we go.
Okay, perfect. So if these are great swords from the Doge's Palace, really the easiest picture I was able to pick now without losing too much time. We can see the huge ones standing in the middle. For example, the one with those twirl and the straight blade, or even the two ones with the wavy blades. You can see that curly, huge hilt, or that slim
Yeah.
slim ricasso. The ricasso is the part without blade between the hilt and the paring lugs. That ricasso in German style usually is quite thin if compared to the blade. Is particularly evident on the right side. You see there's a way to point like with drawing.
I'm checking. Let me see if there's a.
Because I think not.
No, I see an edit layout. No, I don't think so. But if you maybe if you number them from left to right, like I think we can understand what we're talking about.
Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you pick the number 4 with those like yak horn pairing lugs, you see the blade at the tip is wider, and toward the ricasso there's like this little step, and the ricasso is thinner. That kind of feature is specifically German. There are other styles of them, so there are variants that you can recognize as German, but then if you look in details, you can see that we have differences, and Germany is really large, so there would be a lot to study and to tell about where exactly this blade were smiths.
And before you move to something else, sorry, is that widening in the blade, you think, at the tip to add, let's say, percussive force at the tip? Because obviously you have more mass there.
Yeah, I think so. You need to realize also that anyways, this kind of blade that tend to be really thin at the tip, especially these. I don't remember, some of them has an hexagonal cross section, some of them I think even lenticular, but yeah, they are quite good balanced, because that wide blade is wide but is thin. But the point I was trying to get to, but I got lost in my own description, is this kind of swords that we all know about are really late examples. There are specimens with the date engraved on the blade, and usually, at least so far, we haven't found any blade with the date earlier than like 1550 something, and usually they are later, like 1570, 1590. There are some example even in Austria. And if you look at iconography, this is confirmed. So for the first half of the 16th century, usually we do not see this kind of blade or this kind of hilt. So it really amused me every time I attend some reenactor fair or event. Many times people dressed as Landsknecht with the outfit of the first half of the century like this kind of style. But if we if we had to stick to the sources, we have no evidence that this kind of, let's say, Zweihander was something used by the early Landsknechts. So you would need to pair this kind of style with a different kind of outfit, with a different fashion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is matches a lot, well, what happens in a lot of history, but I've seen a lot, especially for the Middle Ages, where uh, yeah, it's often the case that 1,000 years get lumped into the name of Middle Ages, but then you actually have style differences even within a decade that are very radical. And when you see those, you can't unsee the anachronism and some kind of reconstruction. So, okay, really cool. Um, I actually think maybe we can save some of the other topics because I mean we can go on for hours, I
Forever,
suppose.
forever,
But
forever, forever.
exactly. But so I would just maybe ask you, and again, if you have any questions, drop them now. This is your chance. Of course, you can always drop them later, and we can have another live stream as well if Niccolò is available.
Yes.
But this is your chance now. But I'd like to maybe understand what the current. So you mentioned a few different researchers. You mentioned your own work, and for a kind of sword that is not that well understood, or perhaps there's the impression that it's not well understood, that seems like that there's already a lot of work out there for it. So what would be the top resources you would suggest to someone who's wanting to learn about the Spadone now, and which are, let's say, up to date and which you consider well researched?
Well, Niels Melville book is absolutely the book you need to read if you're into this kind of topic, because of course he spent 10 years doing research, and the book was published in 2018, if I remember correctly. So most of the research he has done was even prior to internet. I mean, he had to walk a lot to see a lot of museums around the world. He had the chance to do it, and was well worth it. So is worth buying. Maybe you are not going to find the paper version, because one of the last time I heard about that was already sold out, but I think there's a digital version, so you can buy the ebook. And if you know a little bit of Spanish, you can buy another book that is La Espada de dos Manos y el Montante, by Pablo Moya Montes, and the publisher is Aegea Editora, is a publisher from Spain that is specifically meant for fencing books and treatises. And if Neil made a wider perspective on the topic, Pablo focused mainly on Portuguese and Spanish sources. He published 2 editions. So there's the first one. The second one is enriched by some other sources that I was able to find, and to provide Pablo to make a work even more complete. So right now, I think you can buy the second edition, and I know that they are working on an English translation. So if you are not proficient in Spanish, you can just wait, keep an eye on the Facebook page of the publisher, and hoping to get a copy. I don't remember exactly what their the publishing date is. So maybe this year, but I don't remember. And this for what concern the books. And specifically books that do not focus on fencing, because if you're talking about fencing, you can of course find a lot about longsword, for example. But I guess that some of you already know about the topic. So the interesting thing is exploring something that most of the people usually do not talk about. And I see that Gabriele is out again. I hope he comes back. What else? You can find some articles on my website, so thespadoneproject.com. There are some articles written in English. There's not much, because I've spent most of the time doing research, so I have really spare time, and if I want to go on with a book, I cannot spend much time writing extra stuff to publish. But recently, I started to think that maybe something new could be published. And what else? Yes, I think these are pretty good source-stuffed books and documents you can read, because otherwise, of course, you can find other YouTube videos and other articles. There is an old article that is called what's the name? An overview on Iberian Montante, written by my friend and fencing instructor Tom Puey from Spain. And that was one of the early articles that were really useful to start researching on. And I remember now that there's a page on my website where you can find a list of interesting sources that are available online. So probably you can have a check at them. And I check if Gabriele has some issues. Just a second. Okay. Well, it could be worse. Okay, I'm the king of the live now. I can't even read the comments if someone. Let's try to open YouTube and see if someone wrote something. Okay, nothing. Well, I think that while we wait for Gabriele, I will make some. I will take my time for some promotion. And just recently, November.
Sorry about that.
Okay, nice.
I don't know what happened again, but
no problem. I was starting promotion because I ended the list. I ended the list of suggestion for advice for
Perfect.
reading, and so I was trying to fill the time.
Thank you
before you're coming back. So I was telling the people that just recently I started a Patreon page along with Julian, and that is a way to make more affordable the project, because we go around, we need to buy some stuff, we want to make some more videos in the near future, so we're trying to gear up for make at least a basic level of quality of YouTube content. We want to bring some insight into some of the specimen that we are going to check in museums. And so
I think looking forward to the videos for sure.
Yeah, so if some of the people that will see the video even in the next days, if some is interested in supporting the project, of course, we really want to focus on research. So we're not going to provide, like 10 tiers of stuff with different perks and all the kind of content creator memorabilia and the like. We just want to gain a little money. So is one tier is like €2 a month. We provide like once a month a recap, a long list description of what has been going on over the last month. We publish some pictures of the blades, and basically that helps us even make more, because so far for many years I've paid all the material and the trips I've made. I've bought a lot of book. I can afford to do that, but of course, if we have a little bit more of money, we can try to do more. And I am busy. Julian is even busier than me, but we always try to go like like a train and make as much as possible every month.
Yeah, so I know the sword community definitely is a big market. So I would invite anyone who has the €2 to support research, because that's how we then get also the cool reproductions, the cool videos, and everything that is the, let's say, non-academic but enjoyable side of the community. And speaking of community, your focus is obviously very academic in terms of your research, but your interest is also in the sports side, so in the HEMA side. Do you see a lot of opportunities or a lot of use or advantage in kind of mixing the different areas of interest? Like, can your research from an academic perspective have positive influence from, let's say, more people practicing the treatises, or do you see them as more or actually, I'm sure you don't see them as separate because you do both things, but how important do you think the ability to connect the different sides of interest in Spadone is?
For me, it's just passion. So it's like breathing. I like make this kind of research. I like knowing more. I like to create in my mind the right context, understanding. Then maybe I'm not really focused on being the greatest fencer. It's not my purpose. I know that there are a lot of people around that are not really interested in the more specifically historical stuff. They like swords. They like to fence, to have fun, and that's completely right. But I think that the importance of what we are, I, Julian, and the other guys and people helping us, what we are doing is try to build a more complex and complete perspective on the historical context, because the problem for me, at least, the distortion is not really a problem, but it's distortion. If you just focus on fencing and you spend all your time reading just the fencing treatises, you of course are reading the book written by someone that had an interest in promoting what he was selling. So you do not get the complete picture, and you lose some of the nuances that you would need to understand to get maybe, I say it maybe because I'm not sure, but maybe a more truthful more truthful interpretation of what the fencing sources tells you. Because there are people that tend nowadays to bring the interpretation, at least in my opinion, too much towards sportification, because right now we have some tools and behaviors and cultural biases and stuff that tells us what probably it was back then. But then you have the other cultural perspective, and for example, reading the sources about actual duels. There's an really interesting book written years ago by an Italian author and researcher about duels, and for me is enlightening because it really was a book that broke many of my misconceptions about the context of duels. And yeah, if you spend too much time fencing, you will get a really good fencer in modern terms, but could be that your style in fencing is not exactly what was back then. And if you are interested in reenacting something, you are not interested in being the best fencer. You are interested in being a fencer of the past. Maybe in doing this, make you closer to reality, but it's just speculation. I know that there is a personal bias on how I see.
But I think it's, at least as far as I know, talking to fencers who have, or listening to fencers who have tried sparring with sharps, there is a huge, almost an uncommunicable difference between what you do for sport and what you do when, let's say, even in a safe environment, so not trying to hurt anyone, there is the high risk of injury. So I can imagine that the everyday practice, or like what would happen in the streets during a fight, for example, or during a brawl, or while you attack some enemy on a ship. Oh, for example, one question, I'll keep it for later, but is obviously very different from what you do in the safe environment of training. And I think that's just generally speaking, when you're into history or you're trying to reenact or live it, even get an idea of how it was realistically, you have to kind of make that distinction between sources that are, let's say, academic, even for the past, in a sense. I'm not sure if I'm using the term correctly, but and the real lived experience. So I'll put out a last call for questions, but always, keep in mind that we can hopefully arrange another call with less internet issues. But in the meantime, while we see if any questions do come through, I have two. So one was exactly, I heard about the use of the spadone on ships.
Yes.
So I think this is field of use that would be very unintuitive for most people, but it actually makes a lot of sense. So if there's any interesting thing you want to mention about that, or sources or cases of use, or that would be really cool.
We have some accounts from the Battle of Lepanto, of course, because it was probably the most important naval battle of the 16th century. So we have a lot of tales and chronicles from Italy of what happened. And particularly, we have the story of Antonio Canal. Maybe some of you already know the story, because it's probably the one, at least in Italy, that has been more told, even in blog articles, and is the story of this nobleman of Venice that started fighting with Spadone against the Ottomans during the battles, and he fought with like a kilted jacket, like some kind of gambesson. That was a light armor that helped him fight more easily, and with some like shoes made of rope that you do not need to think probably about something like flip flop. Is the English name flip flops?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Okay, not something like that, but more probably like the Spanish espadrillas.
Yeah.
That are those kind of low shoes with rope used to bind the sole, right?
Yeah.
The soul.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then there's another account from a young guy that was like captain of a galley, and he was from I don't remember sorry, I can't remember the
Yes.
origin town, but no problem. But point is, he was apparently a good Spadone fighter, but in the end, he got shot by some falconet or some kind of cannon. So no good luck for him. There's even the account, at least one account of a clergyman that was embarked on one of these galleys. At some point, he has to leave the cross while he was praying and shouting at the soldier to fight for faith and for the freedom of Europe and all the kind of stuff. He had to leave the cross and take a spadone to fight by himself because the galley was almost got by the Turks. And so, yeah, these are just some of the tales we have, and we do not know exactly what kind of spadone they use because it's counterintuitive, as you say. So, was it a really large weapon, or was more towards the
Mm.
short part of the spectrum? We actually do not know. We can speculate, but yeah, it's just a matter of opinion. We do not have much clues.
And one other thing that comes to mind now, talking about the uh, maritime theater of operations and the use, let's say, the geographical influence or area of Venetian control. Is there any example of the Spadone being adopted or variants or something similar by the enemies of Venice? Or let's say, would you find it, let's say, something similar or something that influenced that along the coast of North Africa, for example, or in the area of current day Turkey? Or do we not know?
Uh, I haven't found anything so far, but I can say that there are some exceptions for South America or
Hmm.
India, where the Portuguese went to trade spices and conquer. And there are at least, I think, two accounts of people from that area stealing or in any way using a weapon from the European. And specifically, I think there's um, one episode of some kind of nobleman or king of a kingdom in India using European armor and espada de dos manos, or
Hmm.
kind of greatsword. But yeah, for the Turks in North Africa that I
Yeah.
know, nothing. But probable, it's probable.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good point to bring the last point,
Mhm.
because maybe it wasn't adopted as much because by that time we start having, let's say, the main cause of decline of the Spadone, which I think you mentioned in a very good example with that account of the young Spadone user that was shot down. So
Yes.
yeah, so maybe if you want to quickly address the decline of the Spadone and what you feel are the main reasons or the main reason for that.
Probably the rise of black powder weapons, so more widespread than we actually understand now, at least in my opinion. There's this impression by reading accounts, even for example for um, reports from the Battle of Lepanto. It's already second half of the century, so uh, quite late, honestly. That is one thing. Another thing probably is the fact that warfare starts to be more and more something related to numbers of people involved, sieges, cannons, mining the walls to make them crumble, and all that kind of things that are really the first expression of what would be the modern way of making war, like on small size, what, for example, First World War became. They are all things really widespread during the 16th century. So it is a context in which it begins to matter nothing how able you are to handle a weapon, but you're just like an ant among other ants trying to submerge the adversary, being with the pikes, being with arquebuses and muskets. At some point, there's even a restoration of the use of cavalry, of horsemen, especially towards the 17th century, something that is not really mentioned many times, but I have a book written by another researchers that make a study on the economy of war during this period, and he, if I remember correctly, states that light cavalry began to be more prominent after the middle, reduction of the numbers, because they were getting rid of heavy armored knights. And so I think these are some of the reason why we see a specialized weapon specifically meant for some tasks that we could maybe refer to in another live. But was there were better weapons to make some of those tasks, and yes.
Cool. So I think to wrap it up, it's a kind of sword that I find is really fascinating because of, well, it's a really cool object, I think, just in general. But then again, I think we're all biased towards swords. So, but
Yes.
It comes through in this time in history where you're seeing these really massive shifts in society and warfare. And as you mentioned, even the rediscovery later of cavalry, again, well, maybe rediscovery is incorrect, but it kind of shows this dip that maybe is due to this kind of convergence of so many changes and experimentation and everything. And it seems to me like the Spadone is one of the different outputs of this turbulent kind of time. So that was really a cool talk. I think we have a lot of points we can definitely discuss in a future call. So thank you everyone for watching. And well, thank you, Niccolò. If you have any final points you want to make.
No, really, if people want to follow the project, as I said, being it on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, or even better on Patreon, we are trying to make more content as time lets us. So it's a good opportunity to know something more, even in written form, that sometimes is better to get a grasp of details, even because speaking English for an Italian is not that easy if you want to provide all the details. Writing is better, of course.
Yeah, and to add to that, of course, definitely everyone follow Niccolò's work, but the extra advantage of doing it is that you're supporting a kind of research into weapons that is moving away from the, let's say, kind of Anglo-centric weapons focus, which I'm not saying it with some kind of nationalistic tint or anything here, but there's so much amazing stuff outside of what is the normally discussed topics all over the world. So if you support, let's say, these kind of more regional research, there's going to be a lot of more cool stuff coming to you in form of books, videos, and talks like these. So thanks a lot again, everyone, and we're done for tonight, I think.
Thank you, Gabriele, for inviting me.
Thank you.
See you next
soon.
time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.